Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. Every year, Bankrate does a survey on the typical American's readiness for an emergency. And every year, as you might imagine, this report has somewhat of a bleak outlook. One of the primary talking points of the survey, and the one that gets highlighted over and over and over again in all the news outlets, is what percentage of Americans can cover a $1,000 emergency. And every year, this stat is alarming. And this year was no different. More than half of Americans wouldn't be able to cover a $1,000 unexpected emergency. Specifically, only 44% of Americans said they would have the cash on hand to cover an unexpected emergency. The remainder would put it on a credit card or find a loan elsewhere or be forced to cut back in spending in order to foot this bill. That's a really bad position to be in, especially considering that if people don't have this money at the ready, the number one place they turn to is a credit card. I have nothing against a credit card if used appropriately, meaning paid off in full and on time every single month, never carrying a balance. But the fact of the matter is, only half of all people use a credit card in this manner. That is a jaw-dropping stat in and of itself, because according to Bankrate, 49% of credit card holders carry a balance from month to month. Basically, that says to me 49% of people who have a credit card should not have a credit card, because if you're carrying a balance from month to month on your credit card, you have no business having one, because there's nothing that you can buy that is worth paying 20, 25%, or even 30% interest on. And it feels like for those of us who sit around talking about finance or watching finance-related videos, it's common sense to say, yeah, pay off that credit card. Don't borrow money that you have to pay a 30% interest rate on. But for half of all people, that's not common practice. In fact, I was recently in a courtroom where the attorney said, I don't see why we can't just pay the minimum balance on the credit card. Why does it have to be paid off in full? I literally had to explain why paying a 29% interest rate on groceries, on gas, on a cell phone bill was absolutely ludicrous and borderline predatory. This lawyer is a very educated person, a person with an advanced degree, but still didn't understand the perils of credit card debt. Common sense is not common practice. And the sad news is that the status of 44% of people not being able to cover an unexpected $1,000 emergency is nothing new. That stat has remained fairly constant year in and year out with this survey. And what's even worse than not being able to cover a $1,000 emergency expense is that almost 1/5 of Americans have literally no emergency savings whatsoever. And this certainly does vary by generation, with younger generations less likely to have an emergency savings built up, and older generations more likely to have savings ready to draw on should the need arise. And this makes sense because when you're younger, you're likely just getting started in your career, you're likely just getting started on your savings journey, and it takes time to build up that buffer. We often hear in the financial community that you should have anywhere from 3 to 6 months of expenses saved up and at the ready to have a fully funded emergency fund. Meaning if your expenses are $3,000 a month, your emergency fund would need to be anywhere from $9,000 to $18,000. And that may feel like a lot of cash sitting on the sidelines. But the good news is that right now you can easily find cash-like accounts, think money market accounts or CDs, paying 5% interest or so. So parking your emergency savings in one of these type of accounts would allow you to generate some sort of return on it. The whole point of an emergency fund is not to make money. It is to bring you peace of mind. It is to be there in case you unexpectedly lose your job or have an illness or a necessary repair, something like that. Your long-term investments are there to make you money. When it comes to your emergency fund, that is to bring peace to your life. You don't want to invest your emergency fund, because what if your emergency fund was invested and the market went through a steep decline and say your emergency fund was literally cut in half? But then you find yourself in a situation where you lose your job and you need this emergency fund. Well, at that point, you're in a real predicament. And while the financial pros tend to recommend that 3 to 6 months worth of expenses sitting at the ready, the reality is most people don't have this. Only 29% of Gen Z meet this metric, 41% of millennials, 42% of Gen X, and 65% of baby boomers. So if you haven't hit this threshold yet, don't feel bad, because for those who've actually hit this threshold, for the vast majority of generations, it actually puts you in the minority. But just because most people haven't hit this threshold doesn't mean you shouldn't be aiming to get there. there. And it can seem overwhelming to have to save up several $1,000s for an emergency expense at first. So just break it down. Contribute what you can on a regular basis and build it up over time, and you'll get there. It's the same attitude with investing. You have a goal of hitting a specific net worth. That doesn't happen overnight. That's something that happens through the discipline of saving and investing month in and month out, year in and year out for decades on end. You don't have to have that emergency fund built up by tomorrow, but if you don't yet have a fully funded emergency fund, it is something that you should be working on. So maybe you say you'll contribute $50 a week, or maybe it's $100 from every paycheck. Whatever you can do, just work on it. Realistically, only 55% of working adults are contributing to their emergency savings on a regular basis. 29% contribute to it with each paycheck, 26% contribute to it on a monthly basis. The remainder alternate between sporadic contributions or never contributing. And truth be told, if you're only sporadically contributing to your emergency savings like once in a blue moon, it's not a priority for you. And if it's not a priority for you, you're never going to have a fully funded emergency fund. The good news is, once you have a fully funded emergency fund, you no longer have to allocate money to it. You just get to let it sit there and be your safety net. I kind of look at my emergency fund the way I look at life insurance. I have it just in case the worst ever happens, but I hope not to need it. And by all means, I don't think you should be altogether halting your long-term investments while working on building up a fully funded emergency fund. I do think if you don't have any emergency fund, you should prioritize building up a starter emergency fund. And in my mind, a starter emergency fund is 1 month's worth of expenses. So it's going to be personalized to your situation. But once you have that starter emergency fund, I think it's totally fine to split your contributions to long-term investments and beefing up that emergency fund until it's fully funded. What I found to be the most alarming stat in all of this is that if they were to lose their job tomorrow, 2 in 3 Americans would be worried about having enough savings to cover a month's living expenses. That is a terrifying position to be in. That is living paycheck to paycheck. Essentially, that is saying you are 1 paycheck away from broke. When you look at this data, you see that it's only a small percentage, 17%, that say they would not be worried at all about covering their expenses for 1 month if they lost their job. I think the goal for everyone should be to get in this category. Because you never know what comes up in life. You never know when something unexpected can happen. Consider that some 60% of all employees have career gaps throughout their life. That should really highlight the importance of being able to cover at least 1 month's worth of expenses. I think having an emergency fund is one of the best things you can do to prepare for your financial future and protect your finances. Yes, investing is important and you should absolutely be doing that, but having an emergency fund safeguards you. It prevents unexpected expense from completely derailing your finances. If you have an emergency and then no emergency funds to draw on, it can lead to you pulling money from places you really don't want to. For starters, a lot of people say they would turn to a credit card. Well, credit cards often have interest rates of 20, 25%, or 30%. That's a really bad place to have to put your emergency expense because it's going to be very expensive. Or consider that a lot of people take withdrawals from their retirement accounts. That can come with a hefty tax penalty, or it can be a double whammy because now it hurts your money's growth potential because you've taken money out of your investments. Or a lot of people resort to taking money out of their home equity, like through a HELOC. You've already worked hard to pay down your mortgage or to completely pay it off. You don't want to have to pay off your home twice. It's best just to have a dedicated emergency fund so it's there whenever you need it. And if your emergency fund isn't quite where you want it to be, if you're 1 paycheck from being broke, here's some things you can do to set yourself up in a better position. Actually figure out how much of an emergency fund you need. I think a starter emergency fund is 1 month's worth of expenses. So if you don't have that yet, go full steam ahead working on building that up. Then your next goal is to get that to 3 to 6 months worth, depending on how much of an emergency fund you need. But there's real power in knowing what number you're aiming for. Get the number in mind. That way you have a concrete goal you're going after. Have a dedicated account for your emergency fund. Having a dedicated account allows this emergency fund to be left alone. You don't want to have your emergency fund in your day-to-day checking account because what will happen is you'll accidentally end up spending your emergency fund, and that can be a problem should you need it. So ideally you have it in its own account and maybe even at its own institution so you don't have the temptation to draw on it. Ideally, you want to keep this savings in a cash-like account, but you still want to capture a decent rate of return where available, so use something like a high-yield savings account, a money market account, CDs. Those are all great options. Actually contribute to it. Okay, this may seem like a common sense step, but as the stats suggest, only about 50% of people are regularly contributing to their emergency savings. So if your emergency savings isn't quite where you'd like it to be, you actively have to be working on this on a regular basis, ideally every paycheck. It can even be a small amount, maybe it's $50 from every paycheck. Small amounts add up over time, but you can't improve what you aren't actively working on. And the best way to make sure you're able to contribute to it on a regular basis is to create a budget and put a line item in there that says emergency savings and get to work. It's no exaggeration to say that an emergency fund can absolutely change your life. To know that you can handle whatever life throws at you can bring you incredible peace of mind. Where does your emergency fund sit? Leave your thoughts in a comment down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I'll see you soon. Bye.